International Grandmaster Ron W. Henley on behalf of iChess.net, and it is my great privilege to present to you Fabulous Fabiano, that is, Caruana's 10 greatest hits. Now, in addition to 10 of his finest games over this part of his career, we will also look at 2 of my favorite combinations, and as we were in production, the 43rd Olympiad took place in Batumi, Georgia, where we will present 3 of the very most recent games against world-class grandmasters. Fabiano Luigi Caruana was born July 30th, 1992, is an Italian-American FIDE international chess grandmaster. As a chess prodigy, he became a grandmaster at the age of 14 years, 11 months, and 20 days, the youngest grandmaster in the history of either Italy or the United States at that time. By virtue of winning the FIDE 2018 Candidates Tournament in Berlin, he will play a match with reigning world champion Magnus Carlsen in November in London for the World Championship. Caruana's peak FIDE rating of 28.44 was achieved in October 2014 after his phenomenal result at the St. Louis Chess Classic of that year. His current FIDE rating after the Batumi Olympiad is 28.27, placing him a solid number 2 in the world behind Magnus Carlsen. His current federation is the U.S., and he led the team to the gold medal in 2016 Baku Olympiad and tied for the gold medal in this recent Batumi Olympiad, where they unfortunately lost on tiebreaks, but he had a stellar performance on board 1. With the upcoming match against Magnus Carlsen coming, it makes sense to take a quick look at their lifetime record. In classical games, Magnus holds the lead 9-5 with 17 draws. In rapid and exhibition games, Magnus's lead expands to 21-11 with 21 draws, and in blitz and exhibition games, Magnus leads Fabiano 12-6 with 4 draws. The first game we will look at, Caruana Berg, is from the Dresden Olympiad in 2008. This comes from a Rubinstein variation of the French defense. Both sides completed their development and had bishops aimed at the enemy king. What I found interesting about this game was move 15, where Fabiano already had his rook on the open d file and played 15 rook at d to e1, signaling his intent to avoid exchanging pieces and going all in for a kingside attack. His hopes were realized with the knight sacrifice 20, knight takes f7, which was followed by the brilliant attraction rook sack 21, rook takes e6, double exclamation point. The exchange sacrifice 22, rook takes d6, leaves the black king under heavy fire, and then the second exchange sacrifice, rook takes e6 on move 28, forced resignation. Absolute brilliant tactical display by Fabiano. Let's take a look. Manuel Berg was born December 1981. He's a Swedish grandmaster and is 2-time Swedish champion. So let's take a look. e4, e6, d4, d5, French defense, knight c3, and pawn takes on e4, the Rubinstein variation. Knight to d7, knight f3, knight out, knight takes f6 check. A kind of simple approach and logical for white. After knight takes, bishop d3. Black logically chips away at the white center, and pawn takes, bishop takes, and then queen e2. Castles, castles, and b6. Bishop to g5, pinning the knight. Bishop to b7, posting the second bishop aimed at the white king. Rook at a to d1, obviously threatening some nasties like bishop takes h7 check, exposing the rook on the queen. Well, the queen sidesteps. Now, it might look tempting to take this pawn, but it's not so easy to exploit those double pawns with these 2 bishops aimed at your king. Therefore, Fabiano plays knight e5. And after rook at f to d8, plays king h1. To me, that's one of the more difficult moves of the game, because yes, you're getting your f-pawn unpinned, and you're getting your king off this c5 to g1 diagonal. However, you're putting the king on the same diagonal as the light-squared bishop. So that, to me, is a tough call. Anyway, bishop e7, and now the move that first struck my attention. Up to this point, both sides have played pretty normal looking moves. But now, Fabi takes a rook that's on an open file, the only completely open file on the board, and plays rook to e1. Well, this clearly in my mind signals his intent to play all out for a kingside attack. He's not interested in just exchanging a bunch of rooks down the d file. Well, then came h6, putting the question to the bishop. The bishop retreats to h4, and then knight to d5. Knight to d5 offers to trade these bishops, and also has a possibility, very serious possibility, of knight to f4, doing some serious damage to white. Well, bishop g3, of course. That avoids the exchange, lines up an x-ray against the black queen, and stops the knight to f4 nonsense. Well, then came bishop to d6. And just thinking about it, it occurs to me that knight to b4, chasing after this puppy, would have been an interesting possibility, but it may have run afoul of knight takes f7. Back to the game after bishop d6, Fabi plays queen e4, threatening mate. Now obviously, you expect the opponent to react, but if he doesn't, of course, this would be the program, penetration with a decisive attack. So after queen e4, black plays knight back to f6, unleashing an attack on the queen, and guarding the mate square on h7, or the check square that is. Well, now Fabi shifts his queen over to the king side, and here, black should play rook at a to c8, and not panic. Instead, in his rush to try and exchange pieces after queen h4, he plays knight to d7. Now it seems if he can trade this pair of knights, this pair of bishops, then white's attacking chances will pretty much evaporate, and black will be well positioned on the d file. However, now comes the fantastic knight takes f7 double exclamation point. This is an attraction knight sacrifice. The sole purpose is to destroy the pawn cover and lure the black king out into the open. Of course, after knight d7, rook d7 is just kind of boring and equal. But knight takes f7, and let the fun begin. Well, king takes f7. And then the question is, how do you follow up the attack? And Fabiano has the answer. You simply sacrifice another rook to lure the king further out into the open. Absolutely brilliant display. Well, the first thing you always have to ask is, what if he takes the rook? But then king takes could be met by something like bishop c4 check. Notice the king is driven further and further out. After bishop check, interpose, queen check. Got a little cross pin on that bishop. Knight to e5. Queen takes. Back. Queen check. 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 And then lightning from the other side. Bishop to b5 check. Well, if knight d7, simply rook e1 check is pretty painful. And that's starting to look a lot like checkmate. Let's go back after bishop b5 check. If the rook interposes, then something like this. Probably here, you could just simply pin this guy. Or you could play bishop takes, bishop takes, bishop takes, and queen takes with a pretty serious surplus. So in the game, after rook takes e6, black decided he already had one piece in hand, and he would play knight c5 and decline that offer. But then came the exchange sacrifice, rook takes d6. After rook takes d6, queen f4 check. 2 hits on the rook, and check to the king. Well, king goes to e7. Then came rook e1 check. All the white pieces are joining the party. King d7 and bishop b5 check. So where to go? In the game, black interposed his bishop. But if king d8, rook e8 mate. And after bishop b5 check, if king c8, well then rook check, rook back, and queen takes queen mate. So after bishop to b5 check, bishop c6, then came queen f5 check. And we can just see the diagonals working overtime for the white team here. If king d8, well, simply check and mate. So after queen f5 check, Berg interposed his knight on e6. But then came bishop takes, queen takes, and another exchange sack, rook takes e6, and black resigned. Now the variation I like here, after rook e6 check, is the back rank mate attempt would be met by discovered check, picking off the black queen. After rook takes e6, there's also queen e6. But then, while the queen is pinned, you throw in bishop takes c6 check. Gotta protect the queen, trade queens, collect the rook, and 5-point material advantage. Therefore, after the excellent rook takes e6, second exchange sacrifice, Berg resigned. The next classic Caruana game we will look at comes from Sao Paulo 2012. Here he's playing black against Sergei Karjakin, the 2016 World Championship challenger, and he's on the black side of an arc-angle Ruy Lopez. Fabi creates an imbalance with the typical 11 e takes d4 followed by 12 knight to b4. This cedes white the center, but looks to create queenside counterplay. With the exchange sacrifice though, 26 knight takes e4 exclamation point, Fabi breaks the white grip on the center and secures a pawn and the bishop pair. This was followed by the second exchange sacrifice, 30 rook takes e3, leaving Fabi with two monster bishops raking the board and the white position with ineffective rooks full of holes and weak pawns. Let's take a look. The standard moves of the Ruy Lopez. Again, we see Fabiano Caruana 2775 playing black against Sergei Karjakin. Everything follows the main line, and then b5, bishop c5. Well, white plays c3, logically looking to expand with pawn to d4, getting the big center. Black plays d6, barricading in, and on d4 simply retreats his bishop. Bishop e3. After bishop e3 in these positions, black has to constantly be on the lookout for moves like pawn up or pawn takes pawn. Fabi castles, knight bd2, and bishop to b7. Well, rook e1, and now interesting play, pawn takes, and knight to b4. This method of freeing the c-pawn and getting counterplay is a typical resource in the Ruy Lopez closed variations. After queen e2, c5. We can see black has a little more space on the queen side, but white still has his center pawns. Now notice, of course, taking this pawn is ill-advised. Why is that? Let's take a look. Something like bishop d2. After bishop takes, queen takes, we can see the knight on b4 is under attack. You'd probably have to defend it, something like this, but then would come pawn takes, and that's some pretty serious monster bishops aimed at the king side. Total compensation. White could also think about simply bishop takes that knight, followed by rook to d1, with opposite colored bishops, and a pretty meaningless pawn. Either way. So in the game, Fabi, of course, is not sidetracked with knight takes e4, continues the queenside counterplay with c5. Well, a3 puts the question to the knight retreats, and we can see there's a lot of pressure here on the d4 pawn. Therefore, white advances. Then the knight rolls over to the king side. Pawn to h3, rook to e8, bishop to c2, both sides mobilizing, knight to g6. So what's a little unusual about this setup is in most closed Ruys, this bishop is over on the king side, and this knight is over on the queen side somewhere. b8, here, d7. So instead, things are a little different here. But the pawn formation represents many closed Ruy Lopez's. Well, Sergei plays b3. But then that weakens the c3 square. And watch how Fabiano exploits that to gain full equality. He plays bishop a5, rook at a to b1, and then boom, bishop to c3. And suddenly, this bishop that was hidden back here has just become a fantastic piece. Well, rook at e to c1. And then b4, gaining space on the queen side. Now, that does give up the knight outpost on c4. However, that knight pretty busy keeping an eye on the e4 pawn. Bishop d3, h6, queen d1, bishop a6, which again is a little counterintuitive in some ways, because you would think you wouldn't really want to trade the light squared bishops, because then you have one less protector of c4. However, you're also trading off one of white's defenders of the e4 pawn, if white agrees to trade. So it's give and take in chess. You get something, you give up something. Well, Karjakin decides he doesn't want to trade the light squared bishops, that he needs that bishop to protect his pawn on e4, and he retreats. But now, Fabi mobilizes his rook. Sometimes I like to ask my student, or students, who's not in the game on our team? And the answer here is the rook on a8. So, a little mini rook lift up to a7. Well, king h2, rook at a to e8, and then g4. Very ambitious. And especially, like we consider Karjakin to be kind of a quiet positional player, and this is a very committal move, going all out for a kingside attack, when it appears justified because it seems like he has control in the center. But as Fabi soon demonstrates, white's grip on the center is a lot more fragile than it appears. And here, he uncorks the excellent knight takes e4. Now, he could have just simply played knight to e5, but knight takes e4, exclamation point, sacrifices the exchange, but after knight takes, rook takes, bishop takes, rook takes. Let's take a look. So he sacrificed the exchange, he has one extra pawn, he definitely has a safer king, because this one's looking a little bit drafty now, and what else? Well, he's got a monster bishop pair. Look at those guys. So, total compensation for the exchange sacrifice. And pawn structure. Black has 2 pawns islands. White has 1, 2, 3 pawn islands. So, no question, tremendous compensation. Well, game continues. Queen c2. Queen e7. Rook to g1. Apparently still has ambitions of playing pawn to g4 and attacking on the king side, but then comes more thunder. Rook takes e3, exclamation point. A second exchange sacrifice. After f takes e3, queen takes e3. So now, in return for 2 exchanges, what does black have? Well, he's got 2 fantastic bishops. He's got much safer king position. He's got 2 pawns, and again, 2 pawn islands to 3, the knight's under attack, and bishop d3 might even be threatened, recouping 1 exchange. So again, overwhelming compensation for the double exchange sack. Well, rook at f to b1, got to get that guy in the game, protect the knight, and then bishop e2. Notice he doesn't even give up his bishop for that lousy rook. Now, of course he could, and then just cartwheel the knight in, and this, of course, is still very, very good, probably winning for black. But instead, bishop e2, just totally putting the question to the knight. Well, then came queen f5, hoping for a little action against f7 and protecting his knight. But then the bishop retreats, bishop to d3, giving the queen the boot. After queen d7, then came bishop e5 check. Well, here, you'd very much like to take that bishop if you're white, but after takes, queen takes, you can see it's not going to be a happy story. For example, if the king goes back to h1, you have queen takes d5 check, bishop check, and knight into f4, and we can see the exchanges come back, and white will still be several pawns behind. After knight takes e5, let's take a look. If rook to g3, well then, simply bishop takes f1. Go back. In this position, after knight takes e5, one last variation. Suppose the king tries to flee with, say, king to g2. Well then, knight check, queen check, check, and mate, an exquisite coordination example versus these silly rooks that aren't doing anything. So in the game, after queen d7, bishop e5 check, Karjakin played king back, but then after bishop e4, queen check, the knight simply interposed, and he resigned. Well, let's take a look. His knight on f3 is pinned. If he tries to play king g2, then the simple queen check, rook up, and bishop takes checkmate due to the pin on the f2 rook. Absolute beautiful example of counterattacking play, double exchange sacrifice against a former world championship challenger.